Hello. Yesterday, somebody on this board posted a story. That story revolved around the exploits of a character by the name of Captain Drake. For those of you who were there at the time and are familiar with the details of this story, I'll get right to the point. I am Hawk. First of all, I can confirm that the story is real. He exaggerated certain events and reworded some dialogue, but the core narrative is accurate. And yes, he did leave the forum afterwards, as stated. That is why I am here. Looking back, I am perplexed as to why this is the case, but Drake and I never exchanged contact details, nor did he do so with any other members of the forum. However, since I'm now aware that he visits this board, I see you lurking. Zoe, I'd like to take this opportunity to try and get his attention. Drake, if you're reading this, I apologize in advance for being cryptic, but if I post my email address outright, I may be flooded with friend requests and be unable to discern which, if any, were sent by you. So I've devised a personalized riddle that only you should be able to solve. Following Drake's departure, the remaining sci-fi regulars and I got together to discuss our options. As stated, our resident subforum was quickly being overshadowed by an exceedingly more popular fantasy subforum. It was clear to us at the time that, with a dozen arcs under our belt and almost every PC either killed or imprisoned, there was little point in sticking around. The party wipe had left most of the players demoralized and reluctant to create replacement characters. And I was frankly out of ideas. The reason I designed the last arc to be so unforgiving was partly because I could no longer come up with interesting scenarios. The game had to end. Finding that we were all more or less on the same page, we decided the only thing left to do was abandon our native subforum and venture out into the new world of fantasy. The prospect of a brave new frontier to explore left most of us feeling refreshingly optimistic, which was a welcome change after such a depressing weekend. Unfortunately, our optimism was misplaced. That fact became saddeningly clear with stunning immediacy. My initial expedition into the fantasy subforum came with 3 realizations. The first, I did not recognize the game these people were playing. Up until this point, I had never bothered to check on the other subforums. Storytelling the sci-fi department kept me too busy, and I'd grown too attached to my clientele to bother branching out. I came to regret this the moment I checked the post detailing the system's various rules. No roles. No stats. No skills. No character ability. I wouldn't mind if my system were being substituted for an alternate one, but that would imply it was being replaced by something. There were no mechanics, only guidelines. Pointless conduct guidelines, most of them too vague to actually mean anything. No trolling, no shit. The second realization, I'm a poor judge of character. The moderator I'd put in charge of this subforum was, to be blunt, a cock. His username was Redwolf, which should have been my first clue. The wolf is a mascot exclusive to the Alaskan and the preteen. More worryingly, he was a control freak and an elitist. A brief glance across the list of threads lead me to notice that a disproportionate number of them were locked. Investigating this, I came across the same passive-aggressive justification multiple times. Since people obviously don't care about this quest, I am locking the thread. If the players ever dare to stray from the railroad tracks, Redwolf took this as an indication that they were abandoning the plot. And rather than making an effort to accommodate their unexpected sentience, he deemed the experiment a failure and shut it down. As for his elitism, there were cases where a newbie roller player would attempt to join the proceedings. Redwolf would alternate between ignoring their actions outright and addressing their presence with a snide out of character comment. Usually telling them to leave because they weren't good enough to participate, albeit with more formal phrasing. Favoritism was another of his immediately apparent failings as a storyteller. He'd often engage in full-length out-of-character conversations with his friends while the game was ongoing, usually awaiting his input. And those same friends would typically find the game world distorting to accommodate them, and blatantly so. Honestly, it baffles me that his realm of the forum was ever more popular than ours. But I may be getting ahead of myself. Let's rewind. Disregarding our early misgivings, we pressed on and began to write up our character proposals. Though a few among us suggested creating fantasy versions of our existing sci-fi characters, we ultimately decided that a fresh start would be preferable. And so, a new cast of characters was born. Zion became Karuk, the grumpy orcish marksman. He used to be a savage beastmaster, launching guerrilla attacks along with his tribesmen on intruding human colonies, until his dire wolf was struck dead in battle. After that, he abandoned his tribe and became a sullen wanderer, wearing the beast's face over his own like a mask. Some were surprised to see her taking on such a serious role, but she ended up providing most of the comic relief anyway. Ronin took on the mantle of Lux, an eager young warrior with a heart of gold and an embarrassingly large greatsword. It approached Buster Sword levels of impracticality, but he played it off well. Most of the time, he'd struggle to lift it even an inch off the ground, but whenever we were really in trouble, he'd get a burst of strength and put it to real use. Under any other circumstances, we might have mocked him for proposing such a weapon, but his last character was Ronin, and anything would have been an upgrade from Ronin. Faye created Sammy, a monk in the loosest sense of the word. She certainly fought like one, but was decidedly also the least zen member of our entire party. Sam was a vigilante. She spent her days patrolling the capital, punching criminals into unconsciousness while spouting profanity and generally making Karuk look feminine by comparison. Archer became Escolt, a modest man who was born into a noble family, but despised his snobbish relatives so much that he threw away his fortunes and joined the city guard instead. His gimmick was that he was always wearing his helmet, even after he left the city guard, and so none of us ever actually saw his face. He consistently adopted the role of the straight man, keeping us in check should our schemes ever become too wacky. He also wielded a buckler and spear, which seemed to be an impressively mundane choice of fighting style at the time. Finally, there was me. Terathy, a child of the slums who grew to become the commander of a respected mercenary corps, the Band of the Hawk. In case you can't tell, I'm a Berserk fan. I proved to be something of a hypocrite, as despite agreeing that we should all explore new character concepts, I ended up making Fantasy Seraph. Composed, well-spoken, but far less uptight than before. It's difficult to be uptight when you're all shitting in the woods together, I suppose. Unfortunately, Scarra departed not long after Drake, so he didn't accompany us on this adventure. But the void he left would be filled before long. Our characters were approved for play in no time at all. I imagine being the forum administrator had something to do with that, but that's conjecture on my part. In any case, an opportunity to test the waters came in the form of a brand new arc, appearing less than 2 days after our arrival. Theft in the capital of family heirloom belonging to a high-ranking nobleman had apparently been stolen, and there was a hefty bounty not only on the item itself, but the head of the individual who dared to steal it. Sounds interesting, I thought. Maybe I misjudged Ridwolf. There was plenty of room for development here, some unexpected twists. Maybe the heirloom is the key component of an occult necromantic ritual. We got our hopes up and dived in. The thread was chaotic in a way that none of us had experienced before. So many different characters acting all at once, trapped in their own individual bubbles of self-contained narration. Everyone was struggling to stand out from the crowd, and as a result, nobody did. At first, I was bewildered. I knew from experience that targeted storytelling for a group this size was impossible, at least without heavy compromise. Well, compromise is exactly what we were given. Rather than attend to each character individually, Ridwolf grouped us up as a single unit. Despite our varying methods, our disparate places of origin, it was a one-response-fits-all deal. Take it or leave it. You are called aside by a man in a dark robe. Greetings. You are looking for the heirloom. Aren't you optimistic about what secrets this mysterious figure may reveal? I begin to type up an inquiring response. Wait. Hang on. Everybody else is typing too. We're all talking to this man simultaneously. How would I take my hands off the keyboard and sit back, curious to see how on earth Ridwolf is going to deal with this omnidirectional conversation. I notice a few of my fellow travelers doing the same, although Sam had no reservations about being one of the first to respond, pinning the hooded informant against the wall. You're spying on me, creep. After that came a dozen or more diverse responses. Some characters took kindly to the man, while others ignored him entirely. A few chopped his head off. Ridwolf's response comes regardless. Yes. The heirloom is close. It was taken by Sybil. Finding myself momentarily distracted from the train wreck taking place before my eyes, I realized something. I recognize that name, and after abandoning the thread for a moment, I discover why. Sybil is our forum's most recent arrival. Not only that, she took part in the last arc Redwolf moderated, and was effectively booted out of the thread halfway through. Her crime was simple. She broke the bubble. She started interacting with another player. At first, Redwolf gave her a warning. "You are distracting other players from the quest. Please get back on track." She protested, of course, rightfully unconvinced that she'd even done anything wrong. Next came a ban warning if she didn't leave the thread immediately. And so she did. In truth, online roleplay is judgmental territory. If an individual isn't considered to be in the top tiers of literacy, they are often disregarded. I have been guilty of that judgment myself. Sybil wasn't a spectacular roleplayer in that regard. Punctuation, capitalization, her affinity with prose, they were all in the early stages of development. And yet, she was the only person who went against the tide and tried to make things more engaging. This might all be an acceptable turn of events, if not for one simple fact: Sybil isn't online. Redwolf has not only usurped control of her character, transforming a cleric into a petty thief out of spite. He's done it while she's not even here, while she can't even react. I find myself growing irritated, and return to the thread. I was absent longer than I thought. The party has tracked Sybil down, cornering her in an alley. The resident edgelords begin to unsheathe their myriad katana and katana-esque weaponry. Fuck it. Abridged version took a stand for Sybil by insisting she was being controlled by the heirloom. Karok, Lux, Sam, Escort and 3 or so of the fantasy native side with me. We end up getting into a brawl with the remaining players. I intentionally begin to wrestle control of the situation out of Redwolf's hands. By fully narrating our own actions and reactions, we effectively render Redwolf's role obsolete. Responses were so rapid that he had no opening to assert himself and decide the outcome of anything. It was, however, a clusterfuck since these players weren't accustomed to willingly taking hits. They were accustomed to everything going their way. On account of Redwolf's favoritism, we begin to utilize the roll function. No stats involved, just a simple case of higher roll wins. However disgruntled they may have been, our opponents catch on and begin to adopt the same method, although some have to ask how to actually use the roll function first. When it's clear that he no longer has any control, Redwolf buckles. He describes Sybil temporarily regaining control and begging us to stop fighting. We do as she asks, and Redwolf abruptly calls it a day with an out-of-character farewell. As much as I insult the man, he handled that situation respectably. Most of my loathing towards him is retrospective, you see, because he only got worse from there. I plan to share an additional 2 stories with you all. First was the time we actually met the real Sybil and accepted her as the 6th member of our fledgling mercenary corps. In the beginning, it was merely an effort to spite Redwolf. My elitist nature prevented me from taking a genuine liking to her, since she really was quite terrible to begin with. But because we were treating her nicely, she began to improve. She started to mimic our style of roleplay, then branch off and develop her own. It was very gratifying to see someone transform like that. The second story was the one I actually wanted to tell. Redwolf struck a bizarre balance between resisting our efforts and actively sucking up to me. Things eventually got weird when he designed an arc which was, at its core, an extremely convoluted plot to force my character into sexual servitude. I started to despise the man at that moment. Karok suggested I ban him outright for being a creep, but I was very adamant about the 3 strike system. So we ended up conspiring against him, forcing him into situations where he would inadvertently break forum rules without noticing. It was a surprisingly exhilarating experience, and we eventually did lure him into 3 separate rule violations. The history of his numerous fuck-ups were ultimately presented to him in extensive detail, punctuated with a sassy one-liner before I banned him from the forum. I would have really liked to tell you all of those stories in their entirety. But Drake showed up about an eternity earlier than expected, and I really just kind of want to marry him, so, sorry.
So yeah, nowhere near as good as part 1 of Captain Drake, let's be honest, but you know, like, it's a nice wee add-on. I felt like, you know, whenever I found it, it would be a shame if I didn't do it, so like, I hope you guys enjoyed, and it's just a nice like, you know what it is, it's like a nice wee expansion pack to the already existing really good story. It's not the best, but like, fuck it, what's the worst that could happen? Also, turns out Hawk is in fact Femoid, so that's pretty cool. And I'll throw up her wee code thing to find her email address on the screen. You know, it's just their names, and, you know, fuck knows, we don't know what their names were, so there's no chance of finding out the email address. But anyway, look, I hope you boys enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video and all that shit. Subscribe, links down below, all that other good shit. Alright, I'll see you later.